The early morning sun hadn't quite burned off the mist clinging to the tarmac as the siblings walked toward their gate. They'd been up since before dawn, packing, double-checking IDs, making sure their carry-ons met the size limits down to the inch. This trip had been months in the making, stitched together with saved paychecks, careful budgeting, and a shared promise they'd made to their grandmother during her last birthday call. "We're coming home to see you." No excuses this time. They weren't flashy travelers. No designer luggage or noise-canceling headphones worth more than a week's groceries. Just two people in comfortable clothes, one with a well-worn backpack slung over one shoulder, the other clutching a small tote with a thermos of homemade ginger tea inside. They moved with the quiet rhythm of people who'd done this before. Not often, but enough to know the drill. Shoes off at security, laptops in bins, belts looped loosely in hand. They didn't complain about the lines or the fluorescent lights. They just kept moving, focused on the end of the journey, not the hassle of getting there. When they finally reached their gate, it was already buzzing with the usual mix of business travelers tapping away on laptops, families wrangling toddlers, and solo flyers scrolling through their phones with tired eyes. The siblings found two empty chairs near the window and sat down without a word. One pulled out a paperback novel with dog-eared pages. The other scrolled through photos on their phone. Old family pictures mostly. Birthday parties, backyard barbecues, their grandmother laughing with her hands on her hips, Flower dusting her apron. Boarding began with the usual announcements. Group 1, premium cabin passengers, and they waited patiently through each wave. They were in Group 3, standard economy, and by the time their number flashed on the screen, the jet bridge was nearly empty. They stood, adjusted their bags, and walked side by side onto the plane. The cabin smelled faintly of cleaning solution and stale coffee, a familiar, oddly comforting scent if you flew often enough. They followed the overhead signs to their row 17 near the wing, the window seat and the aisle. Perfect. They'd chosen these seats weeks ago during booking, paying the extra few dollars for the aisle because one of them hated feeling boxed in, and the window because the other loved watching clouds drift by like slow-moving islands. They settled in without fuss. The window seat tucked their bag neatly under the seat in front, then pulled out a thin blanket they always carried, just in case the air got too cold. The aisle seat stretched their legs as far as they could go, which wasn't far, but it was enough. They exchanged a small smile. No words needed. After years of sharing everything from a childhood bedroom to cross-country bus rides, they'd perfected the art of silent understanding. A flight attendant passed by, offering a polite nod. "Welcome aboard," she said, her voice warm but practiced. They returned the greeting, then turned back to their own little world. One opened their book to the bookmarked page. The other plugged in earbuds and queued up a playlist of old soul music, the kind their grandmother used to play on Sunday mornings while making pancakes. Outside, ground crew signaled to the cockpit. The cabin lights dimmed slightly. The captain's voice crackled over the speakers, calm and steady, giving the usual safety reminders mixed with a cheerful note about the weather in their destination city. Sunny, mild, perfect for a visit. Everything felt ordinary. Peaceful even. The kind of flight you forget about once you land because nothing remarkable happened. No turbulence, no delays, no drama. Just two people heading home, tired but happy, wrapped in the quiet comfort of knowing exactly where they belonged. Then about 10 minutes before takeoff, as the last passengers were shuffling to their seats and flight attendants did their final walkthroughs, someone stopped at the edge of their row. It was a different flight attendant, taller, with a tight bun and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She leaned in slightly, voice lowered as if sharing a secret. "Hi there," she said, glancing between them. "I hate to ask, but we've had a request from another passenger. He's sitting alone a few rows back and, well, he's feeling a bit uneasy. Would you mind switching seats? We can move you to 2 middle seats in row 24. It's just for this flight." The words hung in the air like a dropped glass. Sudden, sharp, unexpected. One sibling looked up slowly from their book. The other pulled out one earbud, eyebrows raised. "Switch seats?" the one in the aisle asked, voice calm but edged with confusion. "Why us?" The attendant shifted her weight. "It's just that he'd feel more comfortable if he wasn't by himself, and since you're together, it seemed like the easiest solution. But we paid for these seats," the one by the window said gently. "We chose them on purpose." I know. the attendant said quickly, her tone softening, almost pleading. And I really appreciate your understanding. It's just a small favor. We'll make sure you're taken care of. A pause. The hum of the plane's systems filled the silence. Around them, other passengers pretended not to listen, but eyes flickered in their direction. No one else had been asked to move. No families, no couples, no solo travelers in aisle seats. Just them. They exchanged a look, not angry, not yet, but alert. This wasn't about seating logistics. This was about who gets asked to make space, who gets treated as flexible, who's expected to accommodate someone else's discomfort without question. We're fine where we are, the aisle seat said. Voice steady now. We'd prefer to stay. The attendant's smile tightened. I understand, but it really would help us out. No, the window seat said, firmer this time. We're not moving. The attendant hesitated, then gave a small nod. All right, I'll check back. She walked away, but the air in the row had changed. The peace was gone, replaced by a quiet tension neither of them had invited, but both knew well. They didn't speak for a moment. Outside, the plane began to taxi toward the runway. The engines hummed louder. The city shrank behind them. One reached over and gently squeezed the other's hand. No words, just solidarity. Because this wasn't just about seats. It was about being seen, being respected, being allowed to exist in a space without having to justify your right to be there. And as the wheels lifted off the ground, carrying them higher into the sky, they both knew one thing for sure. This flight wasn't going to be ordinary after all. The plane leveled off at cruising altitude, and the seatbelt sign clicked off with a soft chime. Around them, passengers began to shift, reaching into overhead bins for snacks, unfolding blankets, flipping open laptop lids. The cabin settled into that familiar mid-flight rhythm. Quiet murmurs, the occasional cough, the hum of air circulating through vents. For a few minutes, it almost felt like things could go back to normal, but they didn't. Not 10 minutes after takeoff, the same flight attendant returned. This time she wasn't alone. Another crew member stood a few steps behind her, arms crossed loosely, watching. The first attendant leaned in again, voice low but firmer now. I know you said no earlier, she began. But the passenger is really uncomfortable. He's elderly and he's traveling alone. We're just trying to make sure everyone feels safe. The words "feels safe" landed like a stone in still water. One sibling looked up slowly, book still open in their lap, but no longer reading. Safe from what? They asked, not sharply, but with genuine confusion. We haven't done anything. I didn't say you did, the attendant replied quickly, glancing toward the back of the plane. It's not about you. It's just, he's nervous. And since you're together, it seemed like the easiest fix. The other sibling, the one in the aisle seat, finally spoke. So you're asking us to give up our paid seats, window and aisle, so he can sit here instead of by himself? And move us to middle seats? That doesn't sound fair. It's just for this flight, the attendant repeated as if that made it okay. And like I said, we'll make it up to you. How? The window seat asked. Will you refund the extra we paid for these seats? Will you upgrade us next time? Or is this just something you expect us to do because it's convenient for you? The attendant blinked, caught off guard. She hadn't expected questions. Most people just nodded and moved. I'm just trying to help, she said, her tone shifting slightly, less pleading, more defensive. Then help him without making us the solution, the aisle seat said calmly. There are plenty of empty seats on this plane. Why not offer him one near someone else? Or ask another pair to switch? Why only us? That question hung in the air longer this time. No answer came. The second crew member shifted uncomfortably but didn't step forward. A few rows ahead, a woman turned slightly in her seat, pretending to look out the window but clearly listening. Behind them, a man lowered his magazine. The siblings didn't raise their voices. They didn't glare or make a scene. But they also didn't back down. They'd been polite the first time. They'd explained their position clearly. And still, the request came again, framed as a favor but feeling more like an expectation. They knew this dance. Not from flying, but from life. The quiet pressure to make others comfortable at your own expense. The unspoken rule that your presence might be seen as a problem simply because of how you look. It wasn't new, but it stung every time, especially when you're just trying to go home. We're not moving, the window seat said, voice quiet but final. We've done nothing wrong. We bought these seats. We're staying. The attendant's expression tightened. For a second, she looked like she might argue further. But then she nodded curtly. Fine, I'll let the passenger know. She turned and walked briskly toward the galley, her partner following. Silence returned to the row, but it was different now. Charged, fragile. The siblings didn't speak right away. One closed their book and stared out the window at the endless blue, clouds stretching like cotton fields below. The other unclenched their hands, realizing only then how tightly they'd been gripping the armrests. After a minute, the aisle seat leaned over. You okay? The window seat nodded. Yeah, just tired of being the easy fix. I know, the other said. But we did the right thing. They both knew what could happen next. Sometimes when you say no to unreasonable requests, especially when you're black, people get upset. They call you difficult. They act like you've ruined their day. They might even escalate it, make it seem like you're the problem. Sure enough, a few minutes later, the lead flight attendant, the one with the airline logo pinned neatly to her uniform, approached. She was older, with calm eyes and a measured walk. She stopped at their row and spoke softly, almost kindly. I heard there was some confusion, she said. I just want to make sure everything's all right. It's not, the aisle seat replied. We were asked to give up our seats for someone who feels uneasy. No reason given. No one else was asked. Just us. The lead attendant listened without interrupting. When they finished, she sighed slightly. I understand why that would feel unfair, and I apologize if it came across that way. But the passenger is genuinely anxious. He's had a bad experience before. We're just trying to de-escalate. De-escalate what? The window seat asked. We're sitting quietly, reading, listening to music. What's there to de-escalate? The attendant hesitated. Sometimes perception matters more than intent. That's not fair, the aisle seat said. Our comfort doesn't matter less just because someone else assumes things about us. The lead attendant looked down for a moment, then met their eyes. I hear you, and I'll speak with the other crew. But please, try to understand we're doing our best. Then she walked away. The siblings exchanged another look. This time there was no anger, just a deep, familiar weariness. They'd been understood before. It rarely changed anything. Minutes passed. The drink cart rolled by. They both declined. The flight attendants avoided their row after that. But the tension didn't fade. It settled like fog, visible to them, invisible to everyone else. Then, from a few rows back, they saw him. An older white man, sitting alone in a window seat, kept glancing their way. Every time their eyes met, he looked away quickly. He fidgeted with his tray table, adjusted his seatbelt, checked his watch. He never spoke to anyone. But his discomfort was clear, and it was directed at them. That's when it clicked. This wasn't about him being lonely. It wasn't about anxiety. It was about who he saw when he looked at them. And that look, the one that said, "You don't belong here," was the real reason they'd been asked to move. They didn't say anything. They didn't have to. They just sat straighter, shoulders back, eyes forward, refusing to shrink. Refusing to disappear, because sometimes just staying in your seat, calm, dignified, unmoved, is the most powerful thing you can do. And as the plane flew on, cutting through the sky toward home, they held that space like it was sacred, because in that moment it was. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the flight settled into its long stretch over the heartland, endless patches of farmland stitched together by rivers and highways, all shrinking into miniature beneath them. Most passengers had dozed off or disappeared into movies on their screens. But in row 17, no one was sleeping. The air still felt thick, like the kind of quiet that comes right before a storm. Not loud, but heavy with something unsaid. One sibling stared out the window, watching the shadow of the plane glide over clouds. The other kept their book open, but hadn't turned a page in 10 minutes. They both knew the situation wasn't over. The way the flight attendants avoided their row now, the way that passenger kept glancing back like he was waiting for something to happen, it all added up to a pressure that wouldn't just fade. Then, without warning, the lead flight attendant returned. This time, she didn't smile. She stood at the edge of their row with her hands clasped in front of her, posture stiff. I've spoken with the passenger, she said, voice low but firm. He's still very uncomfortable, and honestly, it's making things difficult for the rest of the cabin. The aisle seat looked up slowly. How is it affecting the rest of the cabin? No one said a word. It's the energy, she replied, as if that explained everything. People can feel tension. And we're responsible for everyone's experience. The window seat finally turned from the window. So our right to sit where we paid to sit is less important than someone's energy? I'm not saying that, the attendant said, though her tone suggested otherwise. I'm just asking you to be reasonable. It's one flight. 2 hours. Is it really worth all this? The question hung there, loaded and unfair. Because it wasn't really about 2 hours or 2 seats. It was about who gets to decide what's reasonable, who gets to be inconvenienced without question, who is expected to disappear quietly so others can feel at ease. The aisle seat took a slow breath. We've been more than reasonable. We've been polite. We've explained ourselves. And still, you keep coming back like we're the problem. The attendant's jaw tightened. I'm just doing my job. Then do it fairly, the window seat said. Ask someone else, or leave us alone. For a long moment, no one moved. The hum of the engines filled the silence. A baby cried softly a few rows ahead. Somewhere a tray table clicked shut. Then the attendant nodded once, short, sharp, and walked away. But this time something shifted. The siblings looked at each other, and without speaking they both knew this wasn't going to stop. Not unless they changed the game. The aisle seat reached into their pocket and pulled out their phone. It wasn't a dramatic gesture, no slamming it on the tray table, no angry glare. Just a quiet, deliberate movement. They unlocked the screen, scrolled past photos and messages, and tapped on a contact saved simply as cousin. They hit call. It rang twice before a calm, familiar voice answered. Hey, everything okay? The aisle seat kept their voice low. Not really. We're on the flight. Someone got uncomfortable sitting near us. They asked us to give up our seats so a white passenger could move here instead. We said no. Now they're acting like we're causing a scene just by staying put. There was a pause on the other end, just a beat. But it carried weight. Are you safe? The cousin asked immediately. Yes, no one's threatening us. But they keep pressuring us to move. Like our comfort doesn't matter. Don't move, the cousin said firmly. Stay exactly where you are. Don't engage further. I'm calling the airline's customer relations line right now. And I know a few people in their legal department. This isn't the first time this has happened, and it shouldn't keep happening. The aisle seat exhaled, shoulders relaxing just a little. Thanks, keep me posted. And if anyone tries to force you to move, tell them you're in contact with legal counsel. Don't let them isolate you. They ended the call and slipped the phone back into their pocket. The window seat didn't ask what was said. They just gave a small nod. That nod said everything. We're not alone. We're not powerless. Minutes later, the cousin was true to their word. A different kind of energy began to ripple through the cabin. The lead flight attendant, who had just entered the galley, suddenly stopped mid-step as her radio crackled. She listened, her expression shifting from annoyance to confusion, then to something close to alarm. She glanced toward row 17, then quickly turned and spoke urgently to another crew member. Within 5 minutes, a new face appeared at the front of the cabin, a man in a crisp uniform with a badge that read In-Flight Supervisor. He wasn't part of the regular crew. He must have been on standby or traveling as a passenger, pulled in because of an incident. He walked straight to row 17, but this time his approach was different. No demands, no veiled pressure. He crouched slightly so he wasn't towering over them, his voice calm and respectful. I've been briefed on the situation, he said. First, I want to apologize. What happened here was unacceptable. You should never have been asked to move based on another passenger's discomfort with your presence. That's not policy. That's a failure on our part. The siblings didn't respond right away. They'd heard apologies before. Words were easy. He seemed to understand that. I've spoken with the passenger in question, he continued. He's been reminded that all guests are entitled to their assigned seats regardless of who they are. He will not be moved to your row, and you will not be asked to relocate. You have my word. Then he added something that surprised them. If you'd like to file a formal complaint after landing, I'll personally ensure it goes to the right department, with a full incident report from me. And if you're open to it, our customer care team would like to follow up directly. It wasn't perfect. It didn't undo the sting. But it was accountability. And that was rare. The window seat finally spoke. We'll file a complaint. Not for us, but so the next people don't have to go through this. The supervisor nodded. That's fair, and I appreciate you holding us to that standard. He stood, gave a small bow of respect, not exaggerated, just sincere, and walked back toward the front. The rest of the cabin seemed to exhale. The tension that had coiled around row 17 began to loosen. A flight attendant they hadn't seen before brought them 2 bottles of water. No words, just a quiet gesture. A woman 2 rows ahead turned and gave them a small, knowing smile. No one said anything out loud, but the message was clear. We saw what happened, and we see you. The siblings didn't celebrate. They didn't need to. They just leaned back in their seats, the window and the aisle exactly where they belonged, and let the hum of the plane carry them forward. Because sometimes, justice isn't a grand moment. It's a quiet correction, a phone call, a supervisor who listens, a refusal to move when you know you're in the right. And in that moment, flying high above the world, they weren't just passengers. They were proof that dignity doesn't need permission to exist. The rest of the flight settled into a strange kind of calm, not the easy quiet from before boarding, but something quieter, more watchful. Like the whole cabin had taken a breath and decided to tread carefully. The flight attendants moved with extra care around row 17, offering drinks with polite nods, checking in just enough to show they were paying attention, but not so much that it felt forced. The passenger who'd caused all the trouble stayed in his seat, eyes fixed on the seatback screen in front of him, never looking back again. One sibling finally reopened their book. The other slipped their earbuds back in, though they didn't press play right away. They just held the silence between them, letting it do the work of healing what words couldn't. No need to rehash what happened. They both knew, and that was enough. But even as the plane hummed steadily toward its destination, something else was happening far below. In a downtown office where a cousin sat at their desk, phone still warm from the call, fingers already flying across a keyboard. They weren't just filing a complaint. They were making sure it landed in the right hands. Within an hour, an email had gone out, not to some generic customer service inbox that would vanish into digital oblivion, but directly to the airline's head of diversity and inclusion, copied to their legal compliance team and a well-known passenger advocacy group. The message was clear, factual, and firm. 2 black passengers were pressured to give up their paid seats solely because another passenger felt uncomfortable sitting near them. No safety issue, no overbooking, just bias dressed up as convenience. Back on the plane, the siblings didn't know any of that yet. They only knew that for the first time since the request had been made, they could relax their shoulders. They could sip the water offered without wondering if it came with strings. They could look out the window and actually see the clouds instead of replaying every word that had been said. Then, about 40 minutes before landing, the in-flight supervisor returned. This time he wasn't alone. He carried 2 small amenity kits, nothing extravagant, just eye masks, socks, and a note of apology printed on airline letterhead. He handed one to each of them. This isn't compensation, he said quietly, so only they could hear. It's acknowledgement. What happened shouldn't have, and it won't be ignored. One of them took the kit and nodded. Thank you. He hesitated, then added, Your cousin reached the right people. Corporate is already reviewing the crew's actions. And the passenger who made the request? He's been flagged in our system. Not as punishment, but so if this happens again, we'll know it's a pattern, not a one-time thing. That detail hit harder than the apology, because it meant someone was finally connecting the dots. This wasn't just about one awkward flight. It was about how often stories like this go unchallenged, how easily they're brushed off as misunderstandings when they're really about who gets treated as an afterthought. As the plane began its descent, the captain's voice came over the speakers, cheerful and routine. We're starting our approach into city. Weather on the ground is clear, temperature is 72 degrees. The usual landing script. But this time it felt different. Not just because they were almost home, but because they'd made it through something without backing down. When the wheels touched down, there was no fanfare. No standing ovation, just the gentle screech of tires on tarmac, the slow deceleration, the collective sigh of a cabin ready to stretch its legs. Passengers began gathering their things, checking under seats, zipping bags. The siblings took their time. They weren't in a rush anymore. As they stood to exit, a woman from 3 rows up paused beside them. She didn't say much, just looked them in the eye and said, "You handled that with so much grace." Then she moved on, but the words lingered. Outside, the jet bridge connected with a soft thud. The door opened. Fresh air rushed in, warm, earthy, smelling faintly of rain and jet fuel. They stepped off the plane not as victims, not as heroes, just as two people who'd held their ground when it mattered. At baggage claim, their phones buzzed almost at the same time. A message from their cousin. "The airline just called me directly. They want to talk, and they're offering more than a voucher. They're asking how they can do better. Keep your receipts. Keep your notes. This isn't over, but you started something important." They read the message, then looked at each other and smiled. Small, tired, but real. Later, in the car on the way to their grandmother's house, they finally let themselves talk about it. Not with anger, but with clarity. "I kept thinking," one said, "what if we'd just moved? What if we'd said yes to keep the peace? Would it have felt easier? Maybe, but it would have cost us something." "Yeah," the other replied. "It would have cost us the right to belong." Their grandmother was waiting on the porch when they pulled up, apron tied, hands on her hips, eyes bright with joy. She didn't ask about the flight. She just opened her arms and pulled them both into a hug that smelled like cinnamon and laundry soap. "You're here," she said, like that was all that mattered. And for a little while, it was. But later that night, after dinner, after the stories and laughter and plates of peach cobbler, they sat at the kitchen table with their cousin on speakerphone. They talked about what to include in the formal complaint. Timestamps, crew descriptions, exact words used. They discussed whether to share their story publicly, not for attention, but so others would know they weren't alone. "No names," one said. "No faces, just the truth." "Exactly," the cousin agreed. "Let the facts speak. Let the pattern show itself, because that's how change starts. Not with a single dramatic moment, but with people choosing again and again to say, 'This isn't right.' And I won't pretend it is." As they hung up, the house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of crickets outside. One sibling poured 2 glasses of sweet tea. The other opened their laptop, cursor blinking on a blank document titled Incident Report. They weren't done. But for tonight they were home. And that was enough to keep going. The morning after they landed, sunlight poured through the kitchen windows of their grandmother's house, spilling across worn wooden floors and catching dust motes in the air like tiny stars. The smell of coffee and warm cornbread filled the room. It was the kind of quiet, ordinary morning that felt like a gift, especially after everything that had happened just 24 hours before. They sat at the table, laptops open, not because they wanted to relive the flight, but because they knew silence wouldn't fix anything. If they didn't speak up, the next person might be asked to move too. And the one after that, and the one after that, until it just became normal. Another unspoken rule in a world full of them. Their cousin had sent a template for the official complaint, clean and professional, but they rewrote it in their own words. Not angry, not dramatic, just honest. They described what was said, who said it, how it made them feel. Not as victims, but as paying customers who expected to be treated like everyone else. They included the time, the flight number, even the color of the attendant's uniform. Details mattered. Truth lived in the specifics. When they hit send, there was no fanfare, no lightning strike. Just a quiet click and a confirmation email that blinked back at them. "Your report has been received." Later that week, the airline responded, not with a form letter, but with a call from a senior customer experience manager. She didn't make excuses. She listened. Then she said something that surprised them. "We're launching an internal review. Not just of this flight, but of how we train our crew to handle bias, both theirs and passengers." She also offered full refunds for their tickets, plus future travel credits. But more than that, she asked, "What would real accountability look like to you?" They didn't answer right away. They talked it over with their cousin, with their grandmother, even with a friend who worked in aviation. In the end, they asked for 3 things: mandatory anti-bias training for all customer-facing staff, clearer guidelines for when seat changes are appropriate and when they're not, and a public statement acknowledging that this kind of request, asking Black passengers to move for the comfort of others, has no place in modern air travel. The airline didn't agree to everything overnight. But they didn't say no either, and that was a start. Meanwhile, life went on. They helped their grandmother plant tomatoes in her backyard. They walked through the old neighborhood where they'd grown up, pointing out which houses had new paint, which trees had grown taller. They laughed over childhood memories, falling off bikes, sneaking cookies before dinner, hiding from chores. It was healing being here, being seen not as symbols or stories, but simply as themselves. A few days into the visit, a local news outlet reached out. Someone on the flight must have mentioned what happened. The reporter was respectful, asked thoughtful questions, and offered to keep their identities private. They thought about it for a long time, not because they were afraid, but because they didn't want this to become a spectacle. They didn't want people to focus on the drama, but on the pattern. In the end, they agreed to a short, anonymous interview. No photos, no names, just voices slightly altered, telling the truth plainly. We were asked to move because someone felt uneasy. We said no, and we shouldn't have had to. The story ran quietly, a small piece on the metro section of the paper, shared a few hundred times online. But among flight attendants, among frequent travelers, among people who'd been in similar situations, it resonated. Comments poured in. This happened to me on a train. I've seen this on buses. Thank you for saying what so many of us stay silent about. That was the real victory. Not headlines, but connection. Not outrage, but recognition. Back home, weeks later, they received a thick envelope from the airline. Inside was a formal letter outlining new training modules being rolled out across their fleet, a copy of updated crew protocols that explicitly forbid seat reassignments based on passenger discomfort, tied to race or appearance, and a handwritten note from the customer experience manager. You helped us see a blind spot we didn't know we had. Thank you for your courage and your patience. They read it together, then tucked it into a drawer. Not as a trophy, but as proof that speaking up can move things, even if only by an inch. They never posted the story on social media, never made a video, never turned it into content, because for them, this wasn't about going viral. It was about dignity, about making sure the next person boarding a plane doesn't have to wonder if their seat is safe for someone else's eyes. Sometimes, change doesn't roar. It whispers. It shows up in a revised policy, in a crew member who thinks twice before making a request, in a passenger who finally says, "Why them? Why not ask someone else?" And sometimes it shows up in a quiet kitchen years later, when a young cousin asks, "Did you really stay in your seat even when they kept asking you to move?" And the answer comes easy. Yeah, because it was ours. No grand speech. No dramatic music. Just truth, passed down like a recipe or a family photo. Because real courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just refusing to move when you know you belong exactly where you are. And in a world that still tries to make certain people feel small, that kind of quiet strength, it echoes farther than anyone expects. Weeks turned into months, and the flight that had once felt like a storm cloud hanging over everything slowly became just one chapter in a much longer story. Life, as it always does, kept moving. The siblings returned to their routines, work, errands, weekend calls with their grandmother. But something had shifted inside them, subtle but steady, like a compass needle finally finding true north. They didn't talk about the flight often, not because it didn't matter, but because they'd already said what needed saying. The complaint was filed. The conversation had started. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do after standing your ground is to keep living, fully, quietly, without letting that moment define you. But the ripples from that day kept spreading in ways they never expected. One afternoon, while scrolling through their email, one of them noticed a message from a nonprofit that advocates for fair treatment in public spaces. The subject line read, "Your story inspired action." Curious, they opened it. Inside was an invitation, not to speak on a panel or give an interview, but to review a new training module being developed for transportation workers across the country. The module included real scenarios, anonymized but honest, and one of them sounded eerily familiar. Passenger requests seat change due to discomfort with neighboring traveler's appearance. They showed it to the other sibling over dinner. "They're actually using it," they said, voice quiet with disbelief. "Not just using it," the other replied. "Learning from it." That small acknowledgement meant more than any apology. It meant their experience wasn't just logged and forgotten. It was being turned into something that could protect others. Around the same time, a flight attendant they'd never met sent a private message through a mutual friend. She worked for a different airline but had heard about what happened through industry channels. "Thank you," she wrote. "Because of stories like yours, our union pushed for clearer guidelines. Now, if a passenger makes a biased request, we're trained to say no, not just politely but firmly. And we have backup." That message sat with them for days. It wasn't about blame. It was about solidarity. About people in uniform choosing to do better, not because they were forced to, but because someone's quiet no gave them the language to say it too. Back home, they started noticing little things. On a bus ride downtown, a driver calmly told a passenger, "Seats are first come, first served, no exceptions," when someone tried to claim a priority seat meant for elders. At a movie theater, a staff member redirected a customer who complained about sitting near a group of teens speaking another language. Everyone paid the same price. Enjoy the show? None of these moments mentioned their flight, but they felt connected to it all the same, like threads in a larger fabric woven tighter because someone once refused to be moved. Their grandmother, sharp as ever, picked up on the change in them. One evening, as they sat on her porch shelling peas, she looked over and said, "You carry yourself different now. Like you don't ask permission to take up space." They smiled. "Maybe I finally stopped thinking I needed to." She nodded, snapping a pod with her thumb. "Good, you never did." The truth was, the flight hadn't just been about seats. It had been about belonging. About realizing that respect isn't something you earn by being quiet. It's something you claim by being present. And once you understand that, it changes how you move through the world. They began saying no more often, not in anger, but in clarity. No to being overcharged because the cashier assumed they wouldn't notice. No to being followed in stores. No to explanations that weren't theirs to give. And with every no, they felt a little lighter, like they were shedding layers of old expectations they'd carried without even knowing. But they also said yes, more, to joy, to rest, to small pleasures. They took weekend trips just because. They cooked meals that took hours just to savor the smell. They called old friends just to laugh. Because dignity isn't only about fighting injustice, it's also about claiming the right to peace. Months later, the airline sent another update, not because they had to, but because they'd committed to transparency. The new anti-bias training was now mandatory for all frontline staff. Early feedback showed a 40% drop in passenger complaints related to discomfort with fellow travelers, especially when those complaints targeted people of color. And internal surveys revealed that crew members felt more confident handling sensitive situations. Thanks to clearer protocols and support from leadership, the siblings read the report together, then closed their laptops without comment. They didn't need praise. They just needed to know it mattered. Then, one rainy Tuesday, something unexpected happened. While waiting in line at a coffee shop, they overheard a young woman talking on the phone. "Yeah, I saw it on that travel blog," she said. "Some passengers refused to give up their seats when asked for no real reason, and the airline actually changed their policy because of it. Made me think, what would I do in that situation?" Her friend's voice came through the speaker. "I hope I'd have the guts to stay put." The siblings exchanged a glance. They didn't say anything. They just ordered their drinks, paid, and walked out into the drizzle, steam rising from their cups, but inside, they felt something warm bloom, a quiet pride not in themselves, but in the idea that their choice might have given someone else courage. That's how change really grows, not in headlines, but in hushed conversations, not in grand gestures, but in the decision to stay seated when everything tells you to move. Later that week, they got a call from their cousin. "You remember that advocacy group? They're starting a peer network, people who faced bias in public spaces, sharing strategies, supporting each other. They asked if you'd consider joining, not as speakers, just as members." They thought about it, not for recognition, but for connection. "Yeah," one finally said. "We'll join. Because healing isn't solitary. It happens in community, in shared stories, in mutual trust, in knowing you're not the only one who's had to fight for your place in a room, on a bus, on a plane." As the year turned, they found themselves living differently, not louder, but freer. They traveled again without dread. They chose window seats without hesitation. They smiled at flight attendants not with suspicion, but with the hope that things were getting better, and the readiness to speak up if they weren't. And when their grandmother asked, "Would you fly again after all that?" they answered with "Oh."